question for you. Beginning a sermon with a question. You won't be tested on your answers, though. Have any of you ever belonged to a Unitarian Universalist congregation in New England? Any of you? No? Oh, well, this will all be new for you. Good, actually. And many of them have been around for at least a couple of 100 years before our current times, even before there was such a thing as Unitarian Universalism. How does that work? We'll find out. I myself discovered Unitarian Universalism in the 1970s in a small town in Massachusetts where I resided at the time. The UU congregation I joined had a history dating to well before the American Revolution. It was founded in the very early 1700s as a Congregationalist church, as was typical of many a UU church in New England. In the late 1700s and very early 1800s, mirroring what was happening to the American colonies at the time, the American Revolution, the formation of an independent United States of America government, things were hopping theologically in New England as well. The Puritan-created Congregationalist church was predominant in much of New England, especially anywhere geographically close to Boston, the Protestant Vatican that sometimes had been called. By many of you actually, because that's where our headquarters are now too. Many Congregationalists at this time were revolting from the long-held theology of the Puritan-based sect. The Unitarians, as I'm sure most, if not all of you know, discarded the Christian belief of the Trinity, that Father, Son, meaning Jesus, and the Holy Spirit were all divine. The newly formed Unitarians believed in just one divine entity, God, who is not split into three personhoods. Jesus was just a mortal man, not divine, but especially inspired by God to become a great prophet of the people. The Universalists, a parallel sect in so many ways to Unitarianism until the two finally merged in 1961. It took that long to get that through. Broke with mainline Christianity over a different theological point. They believed that God was first and foremost a God of love and would never damn anyone to hell as punishment for transgressions. There would be universal salvation for all. Of course, you all know this, right? Okay. Now, the Puritan Congregationalists were a democratic lot, each congregation governing themselves and voting for their own leaders and policies, and now even theology. Thus, many a New England town's first parish Congregationalist church duly voted whether they wished to embrace this new and rather groundbreaking theology of UUism or remain true to the traditional theological Christian beliefs. The winners got to stay in the first parish church. The losers had to go down the street and build another church building. Thus, any UU church in New England especially that calls itself First Parish, well, you know who won the vote in that particular town 200 years ago. Can you imagine what it must have been like back then? Huge changes in the political spheres of the colonies, a lengthy and conflict-ridden revolutionary war, the often fractious formation of a new and novel government, coupled with your very church being rocked by tsunamis of its own kind. Jesus not divine? Shocking to the very roots that Christianity had historically stood for. No hell as punishment for sins? whatever would deter the sinful rabble from going completely amok. Changes of literary epic proportions abounded for both our nation and our two denominations. Just as our new nation has held together despite some dark and tenuous times in the last 200 years, you can think of them, I don't need to enumerate them, the new denominations of Unitarianism and Universalism have held together as well, despite its own ups and downs, and there are a few. One characteristic of both denominations that came to the fore early on was the proclivity to work diligently on social justice issues of the day, from the abolition of slaves to the progressive ideals on the rights of various minority enclaves of people in the last century in particular. Both denominations were decidedly, historically, and ideologically liberal, at least to some, if not a major degree, and still are. Just as our nation has undergone many changes over its history that might very well cause many of our founding fathers to turn in their graves, our joint denomination, too, has undergone prominent changes as well that has challenged us in many various ways. But always, always, we have persevered in even the darkest of times. We, meaning both as a nation and as a denomination. Let's get back to a little more UU history to further this point. Throughout the 19th century, UUs would still consider themselves largely Christian, albeit with a small c, connoting that it did depart from mainland Christianity on some key points. But gradually, during the 20th century, humanist ideology took root in many a UU congregation, whether it be religious humanism, a spiritual humanism, or outright atheistic humanism. This caused another rather tsunami effect within UU congregations. This departure of all or most things Christian and becoming more humanist, more open to various world religions and what they might teach us. I can remember in my home church in Massachusetts in the early 1970s, when the younger members clashed with the older ones over such issues as to whether the Christian cross should be taken down from the front of the sanctuary, very prominent place, or whether the Christian Lord's Prayer would still be recited every Sunday. Heated arguments often abounded. I remember one elderly woman, let's call her Miss Edith, and she was a Miss Edith, a long-time member of my Massachusetts UU congregation, who told me that in her younger years, she had to convince other townspeople of other denominations, Methodist, Baptist, down the street, whatever, that we UUs were still Christian, with some modifications. She sighed resignedly, saying, I guess I can't say that anymore. But, Miss Edith concluded, this congregation is my home, my religious community, and I will stay here despite how much I may differ theologically from the majority here now. But I, meaning I, also have noted in later years, at the turn of the 21st century especially, a UU resurgence for seeking some sort of spirituality, found in, say, segments of such world religions or traditions as Buddhism or Native American spiritualities, or sometimes newly minted ones, a blend of many. Again, it is largely the younger members who tend to spearhead this new trend in UU theology. Apologies to any of you who no longer consider yourself young in years, but young in ideas. Thus, Humanism does not equal secular humanism or atheism, and I have served churches that have told me that, and I would have to correct them. It is just one of the many possible theologies that we are free to embrace, as our fourth UU principle highlights. But our principles ask us also to embrace everyone's right to choose for themselves what theology resonates and is meaningful to each, and for all of us to respect and even encourage each other in that theological journey, wherever it may lead us. Thus, I have seen a subtle and at times not so subtle jostling for predominance within our congregations of what theology will hold sway, which challenges people's ideals of openness and equal respect and tolerance for all. You may know what I mean. There is a wide diversity of beliefs within our own UU ranks, especially in the last few decades. How do we manage such diversity? How well do we follow our own ideals, our principles that ask us to affirm and advocate? How do we hold on to hope amid all these changes, amid all the diversity, which can make it difficult at times to be together in our UU communities? How can we continue to be a house for hope? Well, there are a number of ways we can do so. Past UUA President Bill Sinkford, some of you may recall him, who was in office at the turn of the 21st century before Morales became our president. He invited all UU congregations to consider what might be a common language of reverence among us all. We decidedly are not all humanists of whatever variety. We don't consider ourselves Christian with even a small c anymore most of the time in most congregations. Thus, a common language of reverence could hopefully link us together despite such wide differences in our theological beliefs. A common language of reverence that can both define us for the new 21st century and give us direction to guide us in this new time in our history. In a recent book published in 2011 called A House for Hope by past UUA President John Burens and now also the past Star Queen UU School for the Ministry President Rebecca Parker, addresses these issues by asking us all to contemplate and explore the following questions. And they are: what is it that our house of community stands for, aspires to be amid so much of our own diversity and the world's diversity? How can we approach religious community in ways that promote not competitive parochialism, but authentic interfaith engagement and cooperation? How do we understand not only the nature of God in any broad, various, and liberal meaning of this entity, but also the nature of our being human together? How do we use our powers for good, economically and in our capacity to love, to forgive, and to live as interconnected beings? What is the mission, the work of our denomination's congregations in promoting justice and compassion in this world? Yes, this is a call for action. It's a call for us to work, to use our precious powers of reason to exert ourselves to continuously endeavor to answer all of these questions. As a denomination, we have always been a doing group, working for social justice, the betterment of all equally in our world, rather than a being group whose first and most prominent focus is on what theology holds sway. Underlying all these questions, Bjorns and Parker first asks us, what is our theological grounding for all of our progressive UU principles? Without a good grounding, we may very well find ourselves adrift or with our house collapsing around us. There is a longing to ground one's activism in something other than despair or rage, something abiding and shared that would alter a sense of an isolated and transient existence. According to our authors, for us as a denomination, it is a longing to regain access to spiritual roots that modernity, mobility, and higher education, with its important commitments to critical analysis, have in one way or another disrupted. It is a longing, really, for us to consider those weighty questions Bjorns and Parker have raised for us to ponder and explore. Again, as a doing denomination, we are all invited and encouraged to explore these weighty points with one another, searching together for the answers to such questions and issues of our day, as we have done so in many a previous age and stage of our UU history. It has been said by many a pundit and theologian alike that there is no life apart from our life together. Community is paramount for the human condition if it is to thrive and be healthy. What holds us and it together so that it is aligned with what it understands as the sacred, the source of life. In these times, which may very well be different from former times. As our authors in this book and so many others have said, what does seem to hold us together are our covenants with one another. However, our congregations are a house always under reconstruction. As a covenantal denomination, we are the promise-making, promise-breaking, and promise-renewing group of people. We are always reconciling ourselves to ourselves and to the greater world in answer to whatever bubbles up through the ages. We have always embraced hope that issues can be worked out, conflicts resolved, ideals eventually upheld despite any temporary toppling of an ideal or project or progress. Hope is always there. We are a house for hope, a stance that has helped us retain our congregational life despite any tsunami that may confront us at times. Have faith in that. In this past presidential national election season, we have seen such a wide diversity of ideals come to jarring light, clashing and causing much animosity, fear, anger, and general dis-ease, no matter what side we may have been on politically. A national tsunami, as it were. No matter what side we may have been on in this past election, harsh feelings and opposing ideals still are very much in our midst and will color how the next few years will unfold. As it so often has, our nation's issues have some commonality with what we UUs are grappling. Thus, just as Bjorns and Parker have outlined questions for ourselves to endeavor to answer, they can certainly apply to our nation as well, such as, what does our nation stand for or aspire to be? How can we promote honest dialogue with differing groups instead of crass and chaotic competition? Remember Morales in our reading this morning, asking us to truly listen to one another, especially to those who feel very differently than we do. How do we use our powers for the good? And what grounding do we use to define what that good might be? As Peter Morales opined, we youths have much work to do, now more than ever. As he said, we must go beyond advocacy and protest. Our house for hope, if we are to make real what we advocate in that house, calls us first to really, 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 really listen. Something we use who like to express our views in our sense of righteousness and, yes, even moral superiority may find it difficult to do. But really, really listening to the fears, the despair, the sense of hopelessness many Americans are feeling right now, we can then bring empathy, understanding, and hopefully healing for ourselves and our nation in any small or large way we can. Our precious house for hope, both within UU circles and the much wider universal circle, is worth the effort. We have been through such times before, weathered through them, grown through them, and have continued on. Historically, for both denomination and nation, that is so. I believe that this house for hope can do so again if we all stay together and continue to make real our ideals and our grounding in a common language of reverence, a common faith that encompasses our universal principles. May it be so for us all.